Hello, everybody. This is another episode of Monte's Musings. I know it's been a long time, but I should start making some of these to explain some of the roster moves, I think, and my thoughts on them, because there's a lot of movement in the Overwatch League right now. Today, we're going to start with looking at the new London Spitfire coach, 815, because I've seen a lot of people who seem to be confused about this move, given his sort of lack of success in Overwatch, which we'll get to in a minute. I think he was actually more successful than the record might indicate. And sort of not an understanding of what the Spitfire's needs were, in my opinion, or even really what in an all-Korean roster and in traditional Korean esports team, what a head coach even is. So let's start with what a head coach is. So in most of these Korean esports teams, the head coach is not a strategic coach. These are not people who are deciding the strategy of the teams. These are generally older, very experienced individuals who have done a variety of esports titles, either as a professional player in some case, like we saw with, say, Reach on the Najin teams in League of Legends, or I Love Uv. Both these guys are Brood War legendary players. I Love Uv is currently the head coach of the Africa Freaks in League of Legends. And so they have a lot of experience with training systems in different games, but also in how team house dynamics operate, helping to get a healthy schedule for the players, resolving interpersonal conflicts, these kind of activities. And that's really what the head coach is more of a leadership and organizational figure most of the time, rather than really in the nitty-gritty of strategy, more about how to implement the assistant or strategic coach's strategies effectively and how to evaluate if those strategies have been effective at all. So in terms of 815's role, considering that he has already been coaching professionally since 2007 in esports. So he's currently in his 11th year as a coach. So, and this is across Brood War, StarCraft 2, Heroes of the Storm, and now Overwatch. So there's a lot of experience here. He's done solo games, he's done team games, he's done MOBA, which is similar to Overwatch in many ways. Has not done an FPS before Overwatch, but still seemed to be getting the job done. And he came in late in MVP Space's sort of life cycle in Apex Season 4. So when we look at what to expect from him, it's not that there's going to be some sort of revelation in strategy. It's that he is going to be the central authority on the team and trying to implement other coaches' strategies, keep everybody in line, keep a firm structure within the organization, help to set up all of the practice regimes or regimens for these players. So this is what he's going to be doing. And in my opinion, if we look at the London Spitfire season, this is the kind of central figure they need. Because we can sort of now, in retrospect, look at the London Spitfire and say, okay, they were the Overwatch League Season 1 champions, yet at the same time, in the second half of the season, they actually lost more games than they won. In stages 3 and 4, they were below 50%, even though they won stage 1. So what were the main problems? And for a while, they had three coaches to start the season, obviously with Bishop, who is successful in winning the first stage. They came in with sort of a mishmash of Kongdu and GC Busan players, as well as a couple players from other organizations. And so there was a lot of figuring out how to deal with this roster. And it really, I don't think, was dealt with fast enough. Bishop was obviously left the team. That left a vacancy for Changun to come up and become the head coach. And then they also have J-Field, their other coach. And then later on, towards the end of the season, they ended up hiring Agape as another strategic coach. So by the end, they had 3 coaches again. And so the question with them was always, okay, so they started out strong with a lot of brute force and this aggressive style, but then the regression was very interesting because even in stage 1, one of their major weaknesses was that they couldn't change compositions very effectively on the fly. So that became a question of, can they not do this because they don't have good coaching to teach the players how to have more effective shot calling in the game, which is also a meta skill that a head coach can, with experience in MOBAs, can help with for sure. Or is it the players' fault that the coaches are telling the right things to do, but the players aren't implementing it for whatever reason, which is also why you need a central authority figure to sort of drive it into the players and force them to take the actions you want them to take, or guide them to a realization of how to shot call or how to implement these strategies better, or solve any interpersonal conflicts with the team that may have been holding them back from making these shot calls in the first place because of conflict avoidance or whatever reasons there could be, right? So we sort of had this question answered in the playoffs, because the weird thing, obviously, was sort of a miracle run for the London Spitfire through the playoffs. But in spite of never really learning how to change compositions, all of a sudden, after getting swept by the Gladiators in their first best of 5, they come back and absolutely destroy the Gladiators, and they fix all of their problems. And this was very strange, obviously, because we saw great strategies, counter strategies to exactly what the Gladiators were doing. So that tells us that probably the coaches, the strategic coaches, knew the answers to these issues, but for whatever reason, we're having trouble getting the players to implement them in the games. And my supposition would be that when they were on the brink of losing, this is when they finally got it together. The players acquiesced to their coaches. And had this been able to happen sooner, and we could have seen more of the London Spitfire's coaches' strategies, I think it would have been sort of a very different season for them. So immediately in my mind, the Spitfire's central issue, now that we're done with the season, was not the players necessarily being bad players. It was that the players were not implementing a lot of the strategies for whatever reason. And what you need in that situation is somebody who's really going to stand up, take control of the situation, and figure out the way to get that coaching information into the actual live games. And I think that's what they're hoping that 815 is going to do with this team. And now let's move on to talk about 815's history, because we'll get to the MVP space history and his history as an Overwatch coach in a minute. But to start things off, this guy is really exceptional when it comes to his background. And we literally don't even have people like 815 in the West. So if we go here, we'll take a look at the Spitfire press release, which is, it says right here, began coaching in We Made Fox in 2007. Now, We Made Fox is a very prominent Brood War team. So he began his coaching career then, and then later made the switch to one of the top StarCraft 2 teams in the early days of StarTale, where he became a head coach in 2011. He won multiple titles over at StarTale, the team that became the Afrika Freaks in League of Legends and StarCraft later on. But he won many, many titles through 2013, as you can see here in their press release. But I think the most impressive thing about his career is that when he moved over in 2014 to Heroes of the Storm, and we can say, okay, Heroes of the Storm isn't the biggest esport, but he won 12 first-place finishes with MVP Black, which also coincidentally had one of the best win streaks ever in esports history with 41 consecutive victories. They were incredibly dominant. And he presided over all of this in addition to 7 second-place finishes, right? And he was also coaching 3 different HOTS teams. So he was coaching MVP Space, MVP Miracle, and MVP Sky. So also, coincidentally, Jay Feel, one of the strategic coaches for the London Spitfire, used to be one of his players on MVP Sky. So they already have a sort of hierarchical relationship where he's the boss. So it should be, he knows what he's getting with Jay Feel, obviously, considering he coached him as a player. And then, he already has a good working relationship, one assumes, if he's been hired by this organization with one of his coaches already. So then we have to talk about, obviously, exceptional background, right, for this guy. He is more experienced than basically any coach in any esport in the West, because esports was bigger in Korea, obviously, in the mid-2000s, so there were more opportunities to go professional, and then he sort of kept that run alive for the past 11 years. And this is one of the central advantages that Koreans have in esports, is that they have people who are either old school pros or have been coaching long enough to now be in their mid-30s, because 815 is now 36 years old. So he's in his mid-30s, has that authority, has the experience, and we just don't have these people quite yet in the West in esports. So let's talk about MVP Space, because a lot of people are bringing up these results, right? And we can look at these results right here. Obviously, they were in Apex. When I was casting, they weren't doing so hot, okay? So if we look at 815's record with MVP Space, starting in September, so about a year ago, in Apex Season 4, you see they finished 9 through 12, 5th through 8th, then they got into Contenders, didn't do so hot there, get back into Contenders, did a little bit better in the Season 2 of Contenders. But there's a lot of factors to consider here. So first off, we have we have the issue of what happened in Apex Season 4. So this is his first time coaching an Overwatch team, so maybe you think they're not going to do okay. Well, turns out, if we actually look at Apex Season 4, right here, you can see that MVP Space ends up third in their group. So they barely miss the group stage number 2, which is effectively the quarterfinals, right? So barely miss the playoffs. And they don't even have a losing record. They're 2-1 here, right? They're 7-5 in terms of map score, so they have a +2 map score. So they're literally tied with Runaway at 2-1 with a +2 map score. And the only thing that mattered at this point, because they have a tied map score, is that Runaway, as you can see, won the head-to-head, right? So this is the thing that separates them right now. Even if MVP Space had taken one more map here and made it 3-2, they would have advanced instead of Runaway, right? And Runaway is a team that makes the finals of Apex Season 3. So MVP Space is put in a group with a finalist and the winners, Lunatic High, of the previous season in Apex. So, and then they still almost make it. So you're like, oh wow, that actually isn't that bad at all. I think that's a pretty respectable result. They're probably the best team to not make the top 8, right? So then, okay, let's look at over here. This is Apex Season 3, where you can see right here, there's Lunatic High winning. So then they go into the APAC Premier Tournament. Okay, so in the group stage, first off, so there are a bunch of invited teams, right? In the group stage, they win it against everybody. They beat Envision, who is a Western team participating. They beat Vici and Flash Wolves from Taiwan and China. And then, guess what happens to them? Unfucking lucky. They hit Runaway in the quarterfinal bracket and lose. So there you go. There's another loss from Runaway that prevents them from advancing into a tournament. And you're going to notice that this is a trend about this team. So this is the end of that year. And now we're going to take a look here at Contenders Season 1. And you'll notice that this starts in March. And the key thing that happens here on the side of MVP Space is that they lose Otto to the Shanghai Dragons. So maybe their best player at the time is no longer with them. They have to scramble to sort of rebuild their roster. Now, you can see right here, they go 2-3. So they struggle a bit, right? They're -6 in terms of map score. Still better than the 5th place team on the other side. So barely, again, not making top 4, but they had some roster issues, which I think shook them up a little bit. So then you'll see, okay, they're going to start to stabilize a little bit as we look at the next season 2 in Korea, where they start doing a lot better. Same record, but they have a better map score this time, and they place 3rd. So they're starting to recover. So the point that I'm making, and then also, by the way, guess who they lose to again? Runaway, another hit in the quarterfinals. I mean, this is ridiculous. We look at his record. Runaway has been one of the most, if not the most consistent team in Apex and Contenders, consistently making the finals, right? Finally winning it in spectacular fashion over Kongdu Panthera in this latest season 2 of Korean Contenders. But they've also been denied making it further in the tournament or the league on 3 different occasions now by Runaway. And that's 3 out of 4 of the major results for 8-15 in Overwatch. So as you can see, it's more subtle than you might think, just looking at MVP Space's roster. And I think there has been improvement in spite of losing some of the core players of this roster to Overwatch League teams. And MVP Space in general has lost other core players like Kuki. Also, Closer was coached by 8-15. So they've lost a number of players to Overwatch League teams at this point in time. And then finally, we also have to look at what MVP the organization typically does, because this is a key factor in considering MVP's results in really any esport. And if you're not familiar with MVP, they were one of the initial StarCraft 2 teams. So in the early days of StarCraft 2, when the Kespa teams like SK Telecom, KT, Samsung, they were staying in Brood War. And so that meant that for StarCraft 2, a bunch of new organizations formed to fill the void of the professional StarCraft 2 teams. And this included teams like Slayers, Startail, MVP, Incredible Miracle. Incredible Miracle became Longzhu eventually. MVP is still operating under its original brand. Startail became the Afrika Freaks, etc. So MVP has always had a great reputation. And the thing about MVP, though, is that they're not rich. They're not SK Telecom. You know, they've had a consistent place in League of Legends since the beginning, as well. And they're not going to splash out on big star players. They don't go after established talent. MVP, I think, is pretty inarguably the very best esports organization in the world at identifying and cultivating new talent. And what I mean by that is that Coach Choi, who runs MVP, has a very specific like secret system that he uses. And I've known this guy for years now, where his whole goal is to go into the ladder and find players who are very coachable, who have a lot of raw talent. And he is super good at identifying this across many, many games. And in League of Legends, an example of this is oftentimes the teams start sort of as bottom feeders. They're really bad teams. When I was casting in the early days of Champions in Korea for League of Legends, the MVP teams were absolutely awful. But by the time 2014 rolls around, the vast majority of the players are still on these rosters, okay? So it's the same players that were really bad for the most part, except they become both. What happens is Samsung ends up buying these teams. So MVP White and Blue, or MVP Ozone and Blue at the time, end up becoming Samsung Ozone and Samsung Blue, which becomes Samsung White and Samsung Blue. And these teams with the core rosters that were sort of coached and selected by MVP end up becoming by far the most dominant teams in League of Legends in 2014, and which was also the most competitive year by a long shot in Korea, and therefore in the world. Like 2014 Korean League of Legends was a hyper concentration of star level talent. And they were so good that at the end of 2014, not only did Samsung White win Worlds, but they also, all players off of both rosters ended up going to China and leaving Korea, leaving the organization. So that's like 10 players that all their starters left. So they basically groomed teams from being absolutely terrible into definitively the top 2 teams in the world. And we look at how they dealt with MVP Black and these like their historic 41 consecutive win streak. And so this team, MVP Space, they lost Otto as well, who I think is going to be a very good player in the future, and will get picked up by another Overwatch League team. But MVP as an organization, it takes them a while, is what I'm saying a lot of the time. So with that strategy in mind, and you look at sort of them bringing in 815 to this roster in Apex Season 4, you can start to see some of the logic for having these players in this situation and sort of the slow growth that they were experiencing. So I hope that helps explain a lot more about the Korean coaching system in general, and gives you some insight not only on 815 as a coach, but what I think Spitfire's problems were, the MVP Space history in Overwatch, and then the MVP history as an organization as a whole. So you get a better picture if you're new to Korean esports and don't have this history about why I think this is such a good move. So thanks for watching, and we'll make some more of these videos, in the future about these roster changes as they come out in the coming couple of months.